Because his photographic passion has been almost completely forgotten, critics, historians, and lovers of Frederick Douglass have missed an important question, and that is, why would a man who devoted his life to ending slavery and racism and championing civil rights for all people be so in love with photography? There are 4 reasons for this. First, Douglass saw photography as a great democratic art. More than once, he praised Louis Daguerre, the founder of one of the first popular forms of photography, the daguerreotype, by saying of Daguerre that he was the great discoverer of modern times. He saw Daguerre as one of the greatest figures in the 19th century. With Daguerre's invention, Douglass said, the humblest servant girl may now possess a picture of herself such as the wealth of kings could not purchase 50 years ago, because of the accuracy and the beauty that a photograph offered. Douglass and photography came of age together, which is one aspect of his love of photography as a democratic art. He escaped from slavery on September 3rd, 1838. It's a year before Daguerre and Henry Fox Talbot created the first forms of photography, 1839. Douglass began his career as an abolitionist orator in 1841 at the exact moment in which technical improvements in the camera and in chemicals had reduced exposure times, enabling the proliferation of daguerreotype portraits. Portraits are what fueled the demand for photography. They constituted over 95% of all images in the medium's first 5 decades. Douglass sat for a photograph, a daguerreotype, first one we know of, around 1841, where he first becomes an abolitionist orator. This is actually owned by Greg French, who's a Bostonian. He's the wonderful person, largest private collector of 19th century African-American photographs. Following the publication of his best-selling autobiography in 1845, Douglass became famous at the very time photography became immensely popular. By 1850, there were photographic studios in every city, county, and territory in the nation, in the free states, and virtually every northerner by 1850 could afford to have his or her portrait taken, no matter how poor you were. It was that affordable and it was that accessible. Engravings cut from these photographs, as you see in Harper's Weekly, circulated as frontispieces in books and in the illustrated press, which enabled readers to receive the news visually for the first time. Harper's Weekly is launched in 1857, Frank Leslie's Illustrated, 1855. The first illustrated paper is Gleason's Pictorial in Boston. It could not make money for more than a couple years, so it went under. But the way that the illustrated press allowed people to receive the news visually for the first time is very modern. It's the same way that most Americans receive the news today, visually. When you read Time or People, the news comes to you visually, not necessarily through reading. Douglass's fame depended partly on photography, much as Matthew Brady's famous portrait of Lincoln in February of 1860 elected the president, as Douglass, Brady, and many others said. This is the photograph of Lincoln by Matthew Brady that becomes an engraving on the cover of Harper's Weekly before the Republican nomination. This photograph in various permutations and engravings, in buttons, become truly ubiquitous. And it's important because Lincoln, when he runs for the presidency, was a dark horse. Very few people knew him. Journalists on the East Coast were still calling him Abram rather than Abraham Lincoln. Very not well known at all outside the Midwest. And Americans at this time wanted to know what their candidate, especially a presidential candidate, looked like. And so this image, this photograph, gets widely disseminated. Here's an example, of Lincoln in a campaign button for the presidency. Matthew Brady himself said that Lincoln thanked him and said, "You elected me president." Douglass in his newspaper said, and in one of his speeches on photography said, "The portrait makes the president." Gives you a sense of how influential photography is already by 1860. Douglass associated photography with freedom. This was because the free states enjoyed a love affair with photography that surpassed that of every other nation on earth. American South, however, lacked the cities, roads, capitalist infrastructures, entrepreneurship that enabled photography to flourish in the North. Moreover, in their efforts to defend slavery, Southerners suppressed freedoms of speech, petition, debate, and the press, including photography and visual images, because the truth-telling nature of photography could highlight how dehumanizing slavery was. Douglass defined himself as a free man and citizen as much through his portraits as through his words. His own freedom had coincided with the birth of photography, and he became one of the greatest boosters of this democratic art. The second reason for Douglass's love of photography is that he believed in its truth value, or its objectivity. Even more than truth-telling, the truthful image represented abolitionists' greatest weapon, for it exposed slavery as a dehumanizing horror. Like slave narratives, and Douglass was a master of the genre, photographic portraits bore witness to African Americans' essential humanity, while also countering the proliferation of racist caricatures in the North done by racist whites. Photographers themselves recognized that their medium lied like dogs. Many photographers self-consciously manipulated the medium, solarizing it, airbrushing out unwanted subjects, distorting it in other ways. But what's important is that Frederick Douglass and the vast majority of other Americans, except if you were a photographer, believed that the camera told the truth. Even in the hands of a racist white, the camera created an authentic, truthful portrait and a work of art. Neither Douglass nor his peers recognized any contradiction between photography as an art and photography as a technology. The third reason for Douglass's love of photography is that it highlighted the essential humanity of its subjects. And this was because of the medium's ability to produce portraits for the millions. Douglass here was influenced by Aristotle, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Thomas Carlyle. Borrowing from them, he argued that humans' proclivity for pictures is what distinguished them from all other animals. As Douglass said, man is the only picture-making animal in the world. He alone of all the inhabitants of earth has the capacity and passion for pictures. He went further and said, only humans recognize themselves in a mirror. Only humans have the desire to draw, to make pictures of themselves, either in writing or in the images. And emphasizing the humanity of all humans was central to Douglass's reform vision. Most white Americans, by contrast, believed that blacks were innately inferior to whites, lacking in reason and rational thought, essentially subhuman, and some, like Louis Agassiz, who is in Boston, there's still a building named after him at Harvard, argued that blacks were separate species. That's how innately inferior they were. Ethnologists and other scientists argued that blacks had smaller craniums and brains than whites and thus lacked whites' cognitive abilities. There's this weird vogue of skull collecting in which scientists are using skulls as a way to try to argue that blacks or people of African descent have smaller brains. And it was a vigorous, rich, in terms of the number of articles and books, field in the United States. Douglass dismissed these scientists' methods out of hand with his argument about humans' essential picture-making proclivity. In fact, he says, dogs and elephants are said to possess reason, but they lack imagination, the realm of thought enabling humans to create pictures of themselves and their world. The line separating humans from all other animals was quite clear, he emphasized. Man is everywhere a picture-making animal, and the only picture-making animal in the world. In fact, Douglass called this picture-making power a sublime, prophetic, and all-creative power. The fourth reason for Douglass's love of photography is that it inspired people to eradicate the sins of their society. The power of imagination, which for Douglass photographs especially inspired, the power of imagination allowed people to appreciate pictures as accurate representations of some greater reality. It helped them try to realize their sublime ideals in an imperfect world. As Douglass put it, poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers, and this ability is the secret of their power. They see what ought to be by the reflection of what is and endeavor to remove the contradiction. Douglass considered himself all three: a poet, a prophet, and a reformer, and indeed he was all three. So did most other abolitionists. Indeed, as a group, abolitionists and anti-slavery advocates, from Douglass and Lincoln to Whitman and Sojourner Truth, had their portraits taken with greater frequency, distributed them more effectively, and were more taken with photography than other groups. Anti-slavery people and photographers as a group loved photography. Photography inspired them to remove the contradictions between what ought to be and what is. Douglass's portraits and words sent a message to the world that he had as much claim to citizenship with the rights of equality before the law as his white peers. This is why he always dressed up for the photographer, appearing majestic in his wrath, as one admirer said of this portrait. He always dressed up, out-citizening white citizens. The way he looks, the way he spoke, he's making a claim that he has as much right to be in the wealthiest, most sought-after parlor or the White House or building in the United States. And why he labored to speak and write with such eloquence. He was widely considered one of, if not the greatest orators in the Civil War era, more eloquent even than Lincoln or Emerson. But it was through his images and words that he out-citizened white citizens at a time when most whites did not believe that blacks should be citizens. Douglass made every effort to circulate his photographs. He shared them with absent family members and close friends. He gave them as gifts to new friends. He used them to garner subscriptions to his newspaper, thereby disseminating them further. And his photographs helped promote his talks. He used his photographs for his talks he's using these different media to help disseminate each one. Then, too, he disseminated his portraits on a mass scale by having engravings cut from it. So here's Carl Geer's, the photograph on which this Harper's Weekly below was based. Douglass, however, faced a problem in trying to disseminate his portrait on a mass scale. The halftone process, which enabled photographs to be mass-produced, would not be perfected until the 20th century. So Douglass had to rely instead on engravings cut from them, like you see here, like you see down there. But Douglass, in theory, did not have the same faith in the objectivity of an engraver or a painter as he did of a photographer, because he lacks the camera, this technology that he felt was very accurate. In fact, as Douglass himself said, the vast majority of whites could not create impartial likenesses of blacks because of their preconceived notions of what African Americans look like. The camera overcame whites' preconceived notions of blacks. Even in the hands of a racist white, it represented blacks accurately, Douglass believed. He surmounted the problem of disseminating his photographs with an unreliable medium, such as an engraving, by using engravers and papers he trusted. John C. Butra was his preferred engraver. This is Butra, who does the engraving of his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, which sold 20,000 copies in the first 2 weeks. This image was probably the most popular and widely disseminated photograph or engraving cut from a photograph of Douglass before the Civil War. The photograph on which this image is based has been lost. Harper's Weekly was Douglass's preferred illustrated press. It is also significant that Douglass and most other Americans treated engravings cut from photographs as objective or authentic, much as most people today interpret a half-tone in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal as truthful. And just as a little poll, how many of you in this room, when you pick up a New York Times or Wall Street Journal and you see the photograph on the front page, believe that it lies, do not believe that it represents at some level reality? You are a very, very believing group. Usually there's a few people in the room who no longer believe that a photograph in the New York Times is truthful. Douglass felt the same way, and most Americans felt the same way about engravings cut from photographs. The Illustrated Press, in fact, referred to engravings cut from photographs on their pages as photographs, whereas engravings from sketches were called sketches. Editors ignored the transfer process. Through the engravings cut from photographs, Douglass authorized millions of portraits to be sent into the world. With very few exceptions, these were public portraits designed to bolster Douglass's public persona. For Douglass, photography was not a personal or a sentimental tool or a means to visualize family relationships or friendships. There are no extant images of Frederick Douglass with his first wife, Anna. And the only photographs that function as mementos of his immediate family are a newly discovered image of Douglass with his youngest daughter, Annie. This is the only known photograph of Annie. She dies in 1860. Douglass was emotionally more drawn to her than his other children. It just crushed him when she dies. There's also an 1884 parlor shot of Douglass with his second wife, Helen Pitts, and her sister, and a honeymoon shot, also in 1884, with Helen at Niagara Falls. The sheer number of these public portraits conveys not only Douglass's faith in photography, but his understanding of the public identity that he was crafting. By continually updating his public persona, Douglass imagined the self as continually evolving in a state of constant flux, which exploded the very foundation of both slavery and racism. Slavery, as you know, creates a low ceiling above which no one can rise. And racism, among other things, is defined by the belief that one group of people are permanently inferior to another group of people. By casting the self as in a state of flux, it explodes both understandings of slavery and racism. Douglass's fluid conception of the self conjoined art and politics. In fact, Douglass went so far as to say that the moral and social influence of pictures, particularly photography, was more important in shaping national culture than the making of its laws.
And just to underscore why this was important and reiterate some of what John said briefly, Douglass lives at a time when whiteness, as a sign of superiority, as a justification for oppression, depends on believing in that fixed self. He, in embracing that fluid self that John talked about, reinvented himself visually over and over again. When we can see this in particular in how he reinvented himself during the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation. So before the war, abolitionist Douglass was repeatedly photographed with clenched fists. He's in the act of fighting. This is one example from 1858. This is another example. It's a copy print from a lost daguerreotype. It's also from the early or late 1850s. The only surviving copy, unfortunately, has these black lines, and you can just see his clenched fist down on the bottom right. And there's a third example from the early 1860s, and you can again see his fist clenched here on our right. After emancipation, though, the fist unclenches, to So you can see it's as though one fight, at least, is over. It's another example of that unclenched post-war fist. And another. So pretty much from 1865 onwards, and just forevermore in these Douglass photographs, the fists unclench, and you see these sort of spread fingers, the relaxed hands of Douglass. And there's another shift in representation as well. So over half of the photographs taken before the Civil War have Douglass making direct eye contact with us, staring back into the camera. And this is, another example, really a challenging sort of bold choice at a time when photographers would encourage their subjects to stare off to one side, to do a sort of visionary gaze. After the Civil War, though, the majority of Douglass photos have him in that classic statesman pose. So the three-quarter, rather than the face-on posture, it's a sort of thoughtful contemplation. And even of these less than a quarter, most of those are Douglass in sort of committee shots, so photographed with other people, with his associates, with sometimes friends. Of actual studio shots of Douglass after the Civil War, there are only 12 of nearly 100 where he makes direct eye contact. So he's actually turned this sort of challenging stare into this visionary gaze. You sort of see Douglass the fugitive and the fighter transformed during the Civil War with emancipation into Douglass the citizen, Douglass the great leader, Douglass the great American. It's a visible shift in the battle as one for emancipation to one for citizenship and equal rights. And this is, this might not seem like a sort of radical shift, but for Douglass it was. This was a radical statement that you could not reduce the self just to the bare bones of rational investigation or scientific inquiry. And here Douglass was able to really critique white tendencies to lock enslaved men and women into surface objectification or depict them as scientific specimens. He's really just shifting the boundaries within which it's possible to even represent black selfhood. And he'd been doing this with photography for years, and he would continue to do it until his death. As John mentioned, he was really using photographs to push back against racist depictions of African Americans by white artists. But he was also encountering a whole other set of images. I just want to mention these briefly. And these were images of exposure, so of wounded and available, exposed black bodies, circulated by abolitionists before and during the war as an argument for abolition. So the whipped back of the slave Gordon in this famous photograph, but numerous other branded, auctioned, half-naked slave bodies. And in contrast to this, Douglass makes himself unavailable. He chose never to smile in photographs until the very last few months of his life. And this is one of these very late photographs. And significantly, I think this is October 1894. It's right before his death, and he's returned for the very last time to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And that's the city, of course, where he first settled after escaping from slavery. It's where he first lived in freedom. It's where he named himself Douglass. It's where he attended abolitionist meetings and delivered his first anti-slavery speeches. And in the presence of a young interracial photography team, neither man much older than Douglass himself of the New Bedford years, in the presence of them in New Bedford, he broke his own rule and he smiled for what turned out to be the very last photograph of his very much photographed life. But this was an exception. Douglass believed, as he said over and over again, that a kindly and amiable expression should never characterize the face of a fugitive slave or of a black leader. So he really believed that a broad, inviting, communicative smile undercut dignity. And of course, 19th century subjects, they rarely smile in photographs, but Douglass smiled less often than Whitman, Twain, Queen Victoria, Red Cloud, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Garrison, Emerson. Douglass smiled proportionately less often even than the very severe John Brown. So you have 50 years of this serious, just severe, unsmiling, inscrutable Frederick Douglass. He's a symbol here of solemn, heroic, stoic masculinity, and really pushing the boundaries of possibility for black masculinity. He's liberating himself as well from this very emasculating appeal. Am I not a man? the famous image that circulated throughout the 19th century as an abolitionist emblem. He actually said of another photograph of one of his friends and colleagues, which was a photograph that he liked, "Whatever may be the prejudices of those who look upon it, they will be compelled to admit that he is a man." And I think his own portraits perform that same work of compelling us as viewers to admit that he is a man. They answer this question just with a resounding yes. And actually, just very briefly, he would have been pleased by this, which was Obama's official presidential portrait in 2008. President Obama, with the exception of Nixon, is the first president since Eisenhower to be photographed for his official portrait, not smiling broadly, with a full grin, showing teeth. So Douglass, who advised, of course, that African Americans were representative self, that it had to sort of counteract with solemn dignity that comic, undignified minstrel clown of the broad grin, the wide mouth, he would have approved of this portrait of President Obama. So that was his choice to be unsmiling. Connected to that choice, I think, was also his decision to really just deviate from the traditional 19th century studio practices, which was to have elaborate backdrops and ornate columns, painted scenes and props of flowers and books and vases. Just with one exception, Douglass's photographs are really stripped down. There are no material objects here that might distract us from his face, his monumental form. And this is in stark contrast to photographs of Harriet Tubman, of Sojourner Truth. They have backgrounds of curtains and sofas and tables, and they have props of vases and flowers and knitting needles. And his photographs are also more stripped down than those of Lincoln, Whitman, Custer, Red Cloud, Queen Victoria. On the very rare occasion that he used a prop, he made sure it was really significant. So one of only 6 sittings where he poses with a prop was George Francis Schreiber's photograph, this one in Philadelphia. It's April 26, 1870, and Douglass was there to celebrate the 15th Amendment and its ratification. And I think it's the nature of that occasion to celebrate the very last of those 3 Reconstruction amendments that tried to guarantee freedom and equality for African Americans after emancipation. It's that occasion that explains why he chooses to hold Lincoln's cane. You can see it just visible in his hands. And Mary Todd Lincoln had sent Douglass this cane after her husband's assassination. Douglass called this cane a symbol of Lincoln's humane interest in the welfare of my whole race. There are 3 other photographs where he poses, with a book or a newspaper. And that includes during one of his last ever sittings, which was May 1894, right here in Boston. It's the sitting that gave us some shots that feature his grandson Joseph, the only blood relative, apart from Annie, to ever participate in a sitting with Douglass. And it gave us as well just the most dramatic exception to his usual aesthetic of simplicity. So you can see Douglass sits in this chair with these ornate lion's heads carved into the arms. And I think his decision to sit in this chair at this moment is quite telling. So he's in ill health. He's feeling physically vulnerable, but he's aware of his nickname as the Lion of Anacostia, which is his neighborhood in DC. He knows for decades people have been referring to him as Leonine, talking about his mane and his beautiful head. And he chooses at this moment of ill health and old age to cement that mythology. And he posed for at least 4 shots in this chair. So just a series of photographs of Douglass the Lion, holding fast to his own larger-than-life place in the public imagination, even in the face of this increasing physical vulnerability. And I do think, we both think, you can see a small smile here. So for Douglass, this counts as a smile, I think. And it's one of only 2 really smiling photographs, and it comes, like the other one, very late in his life, just months before his death, on his last visit to Boston. I think this is Douglass looking to his legacy and acknowledging his own mythology, and I think it's Douglass saying goodbye. But these are the exceptions, again. These are the rare instances. Apart from this, there are no clues, there are no symbols. He doesn't sit beneath a painted backdrop of a plantation scene. He makes himself inaccessible. This is mostly Douglass hidden in plain sight. And that's in contrast to those proliferating images of black bodies whipped or branded or later in the 19th century lynched. This is a stark a very minimalist use of composition that recreates the black male body as enigmatic, as inaccessible, inscrutable. It's his own aesthetic, these often closely cropped, vignetted portraits, stripped down, free of props, free of distractions, where he can experiment, though, with different angles and try out varied gestures. His aesthetics and his politics did often come together in this process of producing portraits. He tended to favor photographers who were reformers or radicals themselves, and actually his experimentation with his visual aesthetic is most evident when he was working with fellow activists and reformers on sittings. So, for example, he sat here for the abolitionist photographer Benjamin Reimer in Philadelphia, and this is the first ever photograph of Douglass standing. You know, it shows for the first time more than just his upper body. It's from early 1861. He also sat for the abolitionist photographer Thomas Collins in Westfield, Massachusetts. It's one of the first portraits after Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It's early 1863. It's the first time Douglass really does that three-quarter statesman pose that would come to really dominate his portraiture after the 1870s into the 1880s. So he's experimenting when he has the chance, but really doing it in collaboration with these reformers, these radical abolitionists who are also photographers. And in fact, the photographer to whom he comes back over and over again and takes the most images, some of the most stunning ones in this archive, was a man called John White Hearn. Hearn was actually a telegraph operator in Philadelphia in 1859, and he was an abolitionist. And when news of John Brown's raid broke, Douglass was in Philadelphia to deliver a lecture, and an order came through the wire to the sheriff of Philadelphia to arrest Douglass as a conspirator. John White Hearn received this as the telegraph operator who was working that day, and he delayed delivery of the message for 3 hours, and then went out and found Douglass and worked with Underground Railroad operatives to get him out of Philadelphia, which he did. He went from Philadelphia to Rochester, from there to Canada, and from there to England and to safety. But one of the first things he did when he was back from England was visit Philadelphia and return the favor. He sat for John White Hearn, who by then had given up being a telegraph operator and had become a photographer. And he returned to him over and over again in the 1860s and the 1870s. Hearn eventually produced a total of 9 photographs that survive, more than any other photographer of Douglass. Douglass's choices of photographer also included women and African Americans, so it's definitely not just the likes of Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner. For example, this new archive has images by one previously unacknowledged woman photographer, Lydia Cadwell. She was an accomplished Chicago photographer. She took 4 stunning images of Douglass in the winter of 1875 during a speaking tour he was doing of the West. And there are also images in this archive by 4 African American photographers. James Presley Ball took 2 photographs in Cincinnati in 1869, including this one. James Hyrum Easton had a really interesting studio in Rochester, Minnesota, from the 1860s until the 1880s, and he worked with his wife as his photographic partner, and they photographed Douglass during a speaking tour in the Midwest in 1869. There's also Cornelius Batty, who had a very successful studio in New York, working with a white partner. He photographed Douglass there in 1894. There are 3 photographs from that sitting, including this one. He actually went on to become the instructor of photography at Tuskegee. And the 4th African-American photographer was James Reid. He had another interracial partnership. He worked with the white photographer Phineas Headley, and they were the pair in New Bedford, Massachusetts. They took 2 photographs there in 1894, the one I showed you before, and this one. So it's a varied group, basically, the photographers of Douglass across 50 years of him sitting for the camera just relentlessly, becoming so widely photographed that the only figures actually standing between Douglass and the title of the most photographed person in the world in the 19th century are the British royal family. The Prince and the Princess of Wales, unfortunately, had over 600 photographs taken each in the 19th century. So he's doing this, and he has this varied group of photographers, And he actually believed it was so important to be photographed that he would seek out these local studios in the many towns and the cities that he was visiting to deliver lectures. You know, he would often make sure to authorize, to sign his favorite so that his lecture attendees could purchase his image in the days afterwards as a souvenir. And these were, of course, you know, carte de visites and cabinet cards that people were buying and collecting. But there are also 10 daguerreotypes of Douglass, and previously people thought just 6 existed. And there are also 5 ambrotypes that we found. Previously people thought just 1 existed. This is one of these newly unearthed ambrotypes. There's also in this archive a salt print, which is comparatively rare. This is the one up on the screen. There are 2 lantern slides. But among all these images, and with all this experimentation, as John mentioned, there is just that one photograph of Douglass with any of his children, with Annie Douglass. And he was also photographed only once with one of his grandchildren, this single grandchild who he was particularly fond of, Joseph. And even here, I think, these photographs with Joseph are much more about a professional collaboration than anything else. The 2 men had performed here in Boston in May 1894. Douglass would give a speech, Joseph would perform before and after on the violin, and then they came and sat for photographs during that Boston trip, and this is one of them. And all the photographs from this sitting have Joseph with his violin, they have Douglass holding a piece of paper that might maybe relate to the speech he was giving that day. So really, with the exception of this new photograph we've just found of Annie Douglass, you know, even the photographs of Douglass with his blood relative are depictions of this professional, artistic collaboration more than family portraits. Photography for him was a way to create a public, professional, political image. It was a tool of reform. It was a piece of his argument for black freedom and equality and citizenship. And in these just many and varied commissioned and self-directed portraits, you know, in Douglass's lifelong attempt to control and to circulate his own image, I think you see the beginnings of mass media in America, this astute public figure, you know, America's first black celebrity, recognizing the potential for manipulating public opinion across 50 years of a very much photographed life, all the way till this deathbed photo taken February 21st, 1895, the day after Douglass's death. And as far as we can tell, this was a success, this manipulation. We searched for Douglass in museum storage units and private collections and auction houses and historical societies and local libraries. And along the way, we found him in the old photograph albums of unknown Americans from the 19th century. You know, he sits there alongside sometimes their family members, sometimes other public figures, revealing he was a cultural icon in his own time. He was being collected and displayed and gazed upon as a work of art, as a representative American, long before his death. So ubiquitous was this idea of Douglass in your home and on your walls that even before his death, artists started to depict rooms with framed Douglass images. This is by the formerly enslaved man and African-American artist Henry Jackson Lewis. He was a cartoonist for the Indianapolis Freeman, and he made a sketch of his editor of that newspaper at work. And you can see above the desk is a portrait of the editor himself on the right, and the other frame picture is Frederick Douglass. And there are several other cartoons and drawings that were published in this newspaper, including this one by Moses Tucker. It's a family having dinner, but you can see, you know, behind them on the wall is Frederick Douglass in a frame. What this all amounts to, I think, we sort of want to suggest, is the first great visual battle in America's history. This is a battle between racist stereotypes and abolitionist paternalism on one side, and Douglass's photographs of dignity and self-possession. It's a battle that he was waging over the public image of African Americans. And of course, that battle continued after Douglass's death, when he continued to loom on America's walls and in its public spaces in the form of statues and murals and street art, many of which are based on specific photographs. There are 110 murals featuring Douglass around the world. and 14 full-length sort of life-size statues of him, and most of them are indebted to his strategies of representation. What you do start to notice, though, is that these artists, they definitely prefer older Douglass. They prefer the statesman figure of the post-war period. Sculptors chose older Douglass for 9 of the world's 14 Douglass statues, all based on photographs from the 1880s and the 1890s. This is one of the interesting ones. So relentless is the focus on that older statesman, sort of bearded leonine form that on Baltimore's harbor front sits a sculpture of just that head. You can go and visit this 6 foot wide, 6 foot tall, just giant disembodied Douglass head in Baltimore. Only 5 of the 14 Douglass statues go any earlier than the 1870s. For example, Gabrielle Corrin did this one fairly recently. This is 2010, installed in Harlem, and she based it on this photograph here. But this is relatively rare. Far more common is the elder statesman. There are more variations when you reach murals, rather than painters and illustrators and sculptors. So this mural in New Bedford has older Douglass at the center. But it does at least use 2 other earlier images of Douglass either side, you can see. One of them is based on the frontispiece to his second autobiography that John showed, engraved from a lost daguerreotype. And the other is based on a daguerreotype from around 1848. So there are exceptions. There are actually 36 of the 110 murals of Douglass do something with younger Douglass rather than the elder statesman. But still, the elder statesman dominates. And I think this is partly because Douglass can lend himself more easily as the elder statesman to a couple different purposes. So the first is to make him a biblical figure. People like to turn Douglass into a bearded Moses or a wise Abraham. They like to insert him into these Black history tableaus, versions of the Last Supper like this one. Douglass takes the place of St. Peter, who's often depicted as white-haired and bearded in traditional Last Supper paintings. There's another Black history tableau of the Last Supper. You can see Douglass is the only gray hair at the table. And this one's actually in a church. Again, Douglass seated, among the other saints and apostles of Black history. Another useful aspect, I think, of the older bearded Douglass is that he lends himself more easily to inspiration of history paintings. These paintings for sale where he's a symbol of the older generation's achievements and sacrifices. He's a patriarch of the race. This is one of these many examples of these inspiration murals and paintings. This one's called The Shoulders of Heroes We Lean On. This is a much earlier work, installed in Ohio in a school in 1933. It's called Frederick Douglass, Inspiring the Youth of the Negro Race. And you can see again, especially in the close-up, the wise man figure of the 1880s and 1890s. Connected to this, I think, muralists also like that sort of patriarch image because they want to position Douglass at the base of the family tree. So this mural in LA, you can see Douglass is at the bottom of the trunk, and the later figures in history all spring out from him. The mural is called Black Seeds, and he's the seed of that mural's title. He's the first on the tree. He's the father of them all. This one in Baltimore, again, he's at the base of the tree. He's one of the ancestral roots, which is the title of this mural. So basically, as the father of the race, or as an aspirational hero, or as a biblical character, Douglass is just more useful in his mythic sort of wise man persona. He bestows this heroic gravitas on Black history. But just to finish, I think this association of age with respect and with influence points to maybe just one last reason for this appeal, the enduring appeal of elder Douglass. And I think that there is actually a memory politics behind the preference for latter-day Douglass, the idea of him as an important man. The sage statesman, I think, has not just religious and epic resonances, it also has political meaning. Most often, elder Douglass appears in these murals alongside more moderate reform figures. It's as though the Douglass of the 1880s, the insider, the elder statesman who's part of the hierarchy, who's been appointed by presidents to roles like Marshal of the District of Columbia or Consul General to Haiti, it's as though that Douglass is the one who is safer. He's more inclusive. He's the one who belongs on city-sponsored murals and in downtown walls. This is the Douglass with cross-racial appeal. For example, here, you can probably barely see him. He's right up top. It's a mural that's dominated by King and Gandhi. Douglass is quite tiny. This is the blown-up version of him. And these reform murals, they appear often in white neighborhoods, sometimes in black neighborhoods. They have themes of education and uplift and peace and interracial collaboration. When these reform murals touch on emancipation, it's the Lincoln-focused narrative. Here is one from 1933. When they do civil rights, it's the King-dominated version. And you have the elder statesman Douglass joining both these sort of white authorized narratives. And in nearly all instances, muralists are working from 1880s, 1890s photographs. Whereas when artists opt for young Douglass, it's when they want to put him alongside radical or revolutionary figures, and this is especially Black Power leaders. And these are often community murals in historically black neighborhoods, often those with an ongoing radical presence, so sometimes new Black Panthers groups in California. They have messages of struggle and rebellion and black unity. Douglass is there as a companion to Malcolm X, Garvey, John Brown, Huey Newton, and there's a far greater preponderance of young Douglass than in the murals where he features alongside Lincoln and King. So you see artists painting Douglass at the moment of the late 1850s in particular, that moment when he's advocating defensive violence against slave catchers. So around the same age as Malcolm X was, at the height of his influence a century later. So choosing, this Douglass era for a mural like this one in South Central LA, it's a call to the Malcolm side of Douglass, the Douglass that Malcolm X himself liked to quote and remember, the radical Douglass of the 1850s who was an advocate for armed rebellion. It's the insertion of Douglass into protest memory. It's artists and communities trying to mobilize the memory of Douglass for the protest needs of the present. And sometimes artists even acknowledge these very starkly different eras of Douglass pre- and post-Civil War. Here, for example, these are two versions of Douglass, and they even have a clear turning point where one gives way to another. This is by Leroy Foster. It's his experimental mural, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. It's from 1972, installed in Detroit. And you can see his interest in Douglass's, multiple identities. You have this shirtless, muscular Douglass in the foreground. He's breaking slavery's chains by force. And the background, it's that giant, disembodied Douglass head again, godlike, emerging from the clouds. It's Douglass at his most stately, his most leonine. But the mural does more than just juxtapose the fighter and the statesman. It also tells us the precise moment when one Douglass started to become another, because there's a third Douglass there in the middle, pensive, and there's a bearded John Brown standing behind him, his hands resting on his shoulders, his mouth open in speech, and it's the presence of John Brown in this mural that marks Douglass's turning point as 1859. When in reality he did have to choose between two versions of himself, a warrior who would join John Brown at Harper's Ferry, try to arm the slaves, try to launch an uprising, or a reformer who would try to work for the end of slavery a different way, with campaigning, with political influence. And I always think Brown, with his mouth open, is maybe painting a picture for the pensive Douglass of what kind of man he requires, that really what this is John Brown's imagination of what he wants Douglass to be. We know that when the two men met in reality in that stone quarry in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, that the mural evokes with these sort of airborne chunks of rock, we know the choice that Douglass made. He thought the raid would be a suicide mission, and he chose to live instead, to work for the end of slavery another way. And Foster depicts this as a choice between two versions of himself, the freedom fighter and the elder statesman. And we, the viewer, know that Douglass turned away from John Brown's vision of that muscular fighting body, and he went on to become the bodiless head of its background, the wise man of the later photographs, the person who dominated so much of Douglass's own visual afterlife. Thank you. So we did find at Moorland Spigarn this amazing thing, and we haven't said it in the book because we can't prove it yet, but at Moorland Spigarn there are these 3 boxes of photographs from his tour through Europe and actually into Egypt in the very late 1880s. And they're not professional photographs, they're not postcards, they're snapshots, and they follow the itinerary that we know he took. So either he had someone along with him taking photographs, and there's no mention of that in the sort of diaries that were written, or, and the technology would have allowed this, Douglass at that point had, been an early adopter of this technology and had bought himself a camera and was taking photographs. And my gut is that that's what happened, but we haven't been able to prove it, so another maybe project in the future is Douglass the photographer.
Yeah, Zoe's right, we just can't prove it, and so the rise of the snapshot, the Kodak Brownie, is a game changer, because the Kodak Brownie allows people just to snap the button. In fact, Kodak advertised, you click the shutter, we do the rest. You sent the camera with the film in it back to Kodak, they developed and printed it, you just received the camera. It first gets developed in the 1890s, but it doesn't really get perfected until around the early 20th century. So the number of people who actually used the Kodak Brownie was much smaller in the 1890s than in beginning of roughly around 1900. Although that doesn't preclude Douglass from wanting to learn it. He was certainly passionate enough that we think that he spent some time to learn the pre-amateur method, which took a minimum of 3 to 6 months. It's why before the Brownie camera, to be a photographer, you needed 3 to 6 months of training. You couldn't buy the chemicals or the paper off the shelf. You had to mix it yourself. You had to understand chemicals. You had to understand how light flows. And Douglass was sophisticated enough where he understood the process, but because he was so busy, he really didn't have the time to learn how to become a photographer until the Brownie, and he dies before it becomes so widely accessible. Nevertheless, as Zoe said, there's evidence. As Zoe said, there's a box in his file. There's zero context. It would have been unscholarly of us to claim that
But we could think,
photographs.
just as one last piece of evidence, though, we did also find 2 photographs of Douglass in Ireland. And in these photographs, he's standing with these 3 Irish, former abolitionists. And there are 2, and they're quite similar, except one woman has switched herself out in each. So you get, there are 2 women who remain the same, and one is different. And I was thinking, well, why would they have done that? Except they needed someone to take the picture. Douglass stays the same. They basically want their picture with Douglass. So at least we know on his trips, this wasn't a professional photographer. Someone has a camera, and it's traveling with him, and his friends are using it. It's a very ghostly thing, though, to think that the only known photograph of Douglass with any of his 5 children is with the one he lost. That we thought there were no photographs of Annie at all. The other 4 children, of course, lived to adulthood. We have photographs of them into the 20th century with their own children, with Douglass's grandchildren. I did share this with the Douglass family. Douglass's great-great-great-grandson, Kenneth B. Morris, wrote the afterword for our book. And he says, Annie and their family, she's legendary. They talk about her a lot. She's their lost sort of great-great-great-great-aunt. And no one knows anything about her. So this was, a moving thing for him as well, to see this, the child who died coming out of the sort of shadows. That's a good question. And we've definitely seen examples where he's being very picky about which photographs from a particular sitting get authorized. Right. So we have a great sequence where he sits for John Howe Kent in Rochester, and he really liked Kent. He went back, to him over and over again. And he's having an issue. It's a cold day. I think it's January in Rochester. And he's got his big overcoat on and a sort of furry hat that he wore a bit in the 1870s. And the first photograph, the the coat's all crumpled, and the next one, he straightened it, but it's still not quite buttoned right, and then the third one is the perfect one. And the third one is the one that exists in multiple archives. I think it might exist in 7 or 8 different archives, so it's obviously the one he authorized to be sold by the photographer to the public. It's the one he ordered copies of himself. The first 2 imperfect ones, they only exist in Kent's own archive in Rochester. So they're the throwaway ones. So we do know that he was, we've got evidence of photographers sending him a bunch of images, and asking which ones he wants. And he'll pick the perfect one. He had a real eye for that. And sometimes you look and you think these are just the same picture, what's going on. But Douglass would see when a hair was out of place and when his collar was not quite right. So there's no evidence of him railing against a photographer or a photograph. He would rail against engravers who were getting him wrong, and of sketch artists. But there is evidence of him having a real eye for choosing what the very best shot was.
Thank you both
Thank you.
for this history and for your generous and open spirit about what you would find and how you would have interpreted it. John Sullivan.
So even as we claim some knowledge of the order in its past, we know there's much that will never be spoken. Moments of power and community that created lasting ties, moments that are beyond our poor power to capture in words.